Motherhood holds a universal significance in every society, shaping future generations and influencing the cultural, emotional, and moral foundation of nations. In Nazi Germany, however, motherhood assumed a political dimension unlike anything seen in modern European history. It was elevated, weaponized, and transformed into a central instrument of the state's racial ideology. Women did not simply nurture families. According to the regime, they safeguarded the destiny of the Aryan race. The mother, her body, her children, her home, her loyalty, became the axis on which the Nazi future was meant to turn. Behind the exalted imagery, however, lay coercion, discrimination, and a system deeply marked by violence and dehumanization. Understanding the role of mothers in Nazi Germany requires understanding how the regime fused gender roles with racial thinking. When Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist German Workers' Party rose to power in 1933, they brought with them a worldview that categorized humanity into hierarchies of value. At the top stood the idealized Aryan, imagined as biologically superior. At the bottom stood racial groups whom the Nazis considered undesirable or dangerous. This view shaped social policy, education, labor distribution, and family life at every level. Women, especially mothers, occupied a critical place in these hierarchies, simultaneously praised and controlled, honored and monitored, revered and exploited. Nazi leaders believed that the strength of the nation rested not simply on its armies or economic power, but on the biological purity of its population. This conviction led to the adoption of sweeping policies intended to increase racially valuable births while preventing those deemed unfit from reproducing. As a result, motherhood, long a private sphere of family affection, became a matter of public concern and political intervention. The state regulated who should have children, how many children they should have, and even which children were worthy of life. The government intruded into every stage of reproduction, from marriage to pregnancy to child-rearing. The propaganda surrounding motherhood was carefully crafted. The Nazi press, films, speeches, and posters depicted German mothers as noble figures, gentle yet strong, modest yet heroic, devoted entirely to the family and the fatherland. They were hailed as the guardians of culture and the biological essence of the nation. This glorified image, however, had strict racial boundaries. It applied only to Aryan women. For Jewish, Roma, Slavic, and disabled women, the experience was devastatingly different. Many were barred from pregnancy, forcibly sterilized, or murdered along with their children in the concentration camp system. Thus, the same ideology that praised motherhood also destroyed it, revealing its fundamentally selective and violent nature. To implement this system, the Nazis crafted a complex structure of incentives and punishments. Desirable mothers received financial support, national honors, and public recognition. Large families were celebrated as patriotic achievements. The infamous Mother's Cross, awarded on Hitler's mother's birthday, symbolized state gratitude to women who produced 4, 6, or 8 children. At the same time, women who refused to conform to ideological expectations, those who chose careers, avoided marriage, or limited childbirth, were criticized or socially pressured to change their behavior. Motherhood ceased to be a personal decision. It became a civic duty, a political act, and ultimately a racial obligation. Organizations played a crucial role in shaping and controlling mothers. Groups such as the National Socialist Women's League, the NS Frauenschaft, and the Reich Mother Service trained women in domestic skills, hygiene, ideological education, and child-rearing. These institutions spread propaganda and monitored compliance. Women attended courses on nutrition, family care, racial science, and the responsibilities of being an Aryan mother. The state did not simply encourage motherhood, it enforced a particular vision of what motherhood should be: obedient, fertile, domestic, and racially conscious. The connection between motherhood and eugenics reveals the darker side of this ideology. The law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring, passed in 1933, allowed the forced sterilization of thousands of people. Mothers were evaluated on racial and genetic grounds. Healthy Aryan mothers were encouraged to reproduce, while women from persecuted groups were systematically denied the right to motherhood. The Lebensborn program, overseen by the SS, further institutionalized racial selection by providing maternity facilities for racially valuable unmarried mothers and arranging the adoption of children that met strict Aryan standards. These measures turned motherhood into an instrument of biological manipulation. The experience of mothers changed dramatically when war began in 1939. At first, many German families were convinced by propaganda that the conflict would be short and victorious. As the war intensified, however, the daily reality shifted. With millions of men fighting on multiple fronts, women became the primary caretakers of homes, children, and elderly family members. They managed rationing, endured shortages, dealt with bombings, and kept families together under increasingly harsh circumstances. The war exposed the contradictions of Nazi ideology. Although mothers were told to stay at home and focus on childbirth, the regime later demanded that they join the labor force to compensate for manpower shortages. Motherhood, once framed as an honored role, became a burden as survival grew increasingly difficult. The collapse of Nazi Germany in 1945 brought the destruction of families, cities, and lives. Mothers bore the emotional weight of this devastation. Many lost children, husbands, or homes. Others carried the trauma of participating, willingly or unwillingly, in a system that had caused suffering to millions. Some mothers who had embraced Nazi ideology struggled with guilt and shame after the war. Others, especially those who had been victims of the regime's racial laws, faced the unbearable challenge of rebuilding shattered families or living with the irreversible consequences of sterilization and genocide. In the post-war period, Germany had to confront this legacy. The Allied occupation brought political restructuring, denazification, and the introduction of new laws recognizing human dignity and equality. Mothers became essential participants in rebuilding a society free from the propaganda and racial ideology that had shaped their previous roles. In many ways, they helped stabilize the country through their resilience, care, and dedication to their children, despite overwhelming hardship. Their experiences also shaped post-war family policy, education, and memory culture, ensuring that future generations understood the dangers of political systems that manipulate and control the most intimate aspects of life. The role of mothers in Nazi Germany continues to fascinate historians because it reveals how gender, ideology, politics, and violence intersected to create a society built on contradiction. Mothers were simultaneously exalted and oppressed, empowered and controlled, honored and instrumentalized. They were depicted as the spiritual heart of the nation, but subjected to rigid expectations and racial scrutiny. Their experiences varied widely depending on class, race, beliefs, and location. Some participated wholeheartedly in the regime, others resisted quietly, or simply tried to survive. Some benefited from policies designed to support Aryan families, others lost children, fertility, or lives because they were deemed undesirable. This introduction sets the stage for a deeper exploration of the complex systems that governed motherhood in the Third Reich. Each chapter of this work uncovers a different dimension of that experience: the ideological foundations, the construction of the Aryan ideal, the laws and policies that enforced it, the organizations that mobilized women, the catastrophic impact of eugenics, the harsh realities of wartime life, and the lasting legacy of these policies after Germany's defeat. In Nazi Germany, motherhood was elevated to a central pillar of the racial state, a role that the regime presented as both a biological duty and a national obligation. Long before Adolf Hitler rose to power in 1933, nationalist movements in Germany had framed women as guardians of cultural continuity, but the Nazi Party intensified this idea dramatically. Under their ideology, mothers were not merely figures of domestic responsibility. They were positioned as the biological engines of the Reich's future, the individuals who would secure racial survival through childbirth and the transmission of ideological values. This vision placed an enormous political, social, and emotional weight on German mothers, whose private lives became intertwined with the ambitions of a totalitarian state. From the earliest months of the Nazi regime, propaganda emphasized that mothers stood at the heart of national revival. Posters, films, children's books, and public ceremonies celebrated the woman who bore many racially valuable children as the ideal citizen, presenting her as a heroic figure whose contribution to Germany's destiny surpassed even that of soldiers. Nazi rhetoric framed motherhood as an act of service comparable to warfare. As soldiers protected the nation on the battlefield, mothers protected it through reproduction. The idea of biological warfare through childbirth shaped policies ranging from marriage loans to the infamous Lebensborn program, illustrating how deeply the state believed its survival depended on maternal labor. The regime's emphasis on mothers also grew from fears of demographic decline. Germany, like many European nations in the 1920s and early 1930s, faced falling birth rates and widespread anxieties about population stagnation. Nazis interpreted this decline not simply as a social issue, but as a racial danger. If Aryan families did not have more children, while so-called undesirable groups continued to reproduce, they claimed that Germany's racial purity and national power would deteriorate. This belief transformed mothers into frontline participants in what the regime described as an existential struggle for racial dominance. In speeches, Hitler often insisted that the German mother was more important to the future of the nation than any political leader or economic reform. Motherhood in Nazi Germany was therefore not a private matter. It was a state-directed project rooted in racial ideology. The government intruded into the most intimate areas of women's lives: marriage, sexuality, fertility, childcare, health, and even the moral education of children. Nazi policies aimed to standardize and regulate motherhood, promoting what they saw as healthy reproductive behavior while discouraging or preventing childbirth among those labeled racially inferior. In practice, this translated into a climate in which individual choices were subordinated to the demands of the racial state. Central to this maternal mission was the expectation that mothers would raise their children to become loyal followers of National Socialism. Education began at home long before children entered schools or youth organizations. Mothers were expected to instill obedience, discipline, physical fitness, and unwavering devotion to Hitler. They were encouraged, sometimes required, to attend training courses on child-rearing, racial science, and household management, ensuring that ideological instruction permeated everyday domestic life. Even seemingly apolitical activities such as cooking or teaching manners were framed within racial and ideological guidelines. The mother's role was understood not only as biological reproduction, but also as the reproduction of belief. The Nazi state also worked to consolidate mothers into organizations built explicitly to mobilize them. The National Socialist Women's League, NS Frauenschaft, and the German Women's Enterprise, Deutsches Frauenwerk, trained, supervised, and ideologically shaped millions of women. These institutions functioned as extensions of the state within the private sphere, ensuring that the home became a site of political influence. Through mandatory courses, mass events, newsletters, and home visits, the regime cultivated a population of mothers who understood themselves as agents of national transformation, not merely caretakers. However, this elevation of mothers was highly selective. Only those considered racially valuable, especially ethnically German, able-bodied, and politically loyal women, were celebrated. Jewish, Roma, disabled, and other marginalized women were excluded from the Nazi definition of motherhood and often targeted for sterilization or worse. Thus, while Nazi propaganda depicted motherhood as noble and sacred, its policies simultaneously undermined and destroyed the families of those the regime deemed unfit. The same ideological framework that glorified one group of mothers justified persecution, violence, and genocide against others. The symbolic importance of mothers was further reinforced through elaborate rituals and ceremonies. Mother's Day, which had existed before the Nazi era, was transformed into a political holiday. Public celebrations honored women who bore large numbers of children, awarding medals such as the Cross of Honor of the German Mother, Mutterkreuz. These medals, given in bronze, silver, or gold, depending on the number of children, were not merely tokens of appreciation, but markers of political and racial loyalty. Being decorated declared one a valued contributor to the racial state, signaling state approval of one's family life. Despite these grand gestures, the daily reality for many mothers was far more complex. The state's ideological demands often clashed with the practical challenges of raising families in a changing society. Economic hardship, housing shortages, and later, wartime devastation placed immense burdens on women whose work increased dramatically even as the regime insisted they remain focused solely on domestic roles. Mothers were expected to embody an idealized femininity, rooted in sacrifice and selflessness. Yet their lived experiences frequently involved exhaustion, fear, and the struggle to balance state expectations with family needs. As war approached, the contradictions grew sharper. While Nazi ideology promoted the image of the domestic mother, the necessities of wartime production required women, including mothers, to enter factories, offices, and auxiliary military roles. These conflicting demands revealed the inherent instability of the Nazi vision of motherhood. The regime continued to insist that mothers were the heart of the racial state, but increasingly relied on them as workers and logistical supporters on the home front. This dual burden shaped the everyday lives of millions of women and exposed the ideological rigidity of the regime. Chapter 1, therefore, reveals the central tension of motherhood in Nazi Germany. Women were glorified symbolically but controlled politically, celebrated publicly but exploited privately. The Nazi state transformed motherhood into a national duty, intertwining biological reproduction with ideological instruction and state intervention. By placing mothers at the heart of the racial state, the regime sought to build not only a new generation, but an entire racial future. Yet the reality of this vision was one of restriction, coercion, and profound moral consequence. Mothers were made responsible not only for the upbringing of children, but for the preservation of a racial hierarchy that would lead to the persecution and death of millions. Understanding the role of mothers in Nazi Germany is therefore essential to understanding the broader goals and operations of the Third Reich itself. It exposes how deeply ideology penetrated private life and how central women were to the implementation of racial policies. It also highlights the profound contradictions between propaganda and reality, between idealization and exploitation, and between the glorification of some mothers and the destruction of others. Through this lens, we see that the Nazi project was not sustained solely by military or political power, but also by the intimate, everyday labor of mothers whose lives were reshaped, often forcibly, by the ambitions of a totalitarian state. Nazi ideology placed the concept of the Aryan mother at the center of its racial, cultural, and political worldview. This idealized figure was not simply a woman who raised children, but a symbolic representation of purity, strength, and national continuity. To the Nazis, the Aryan mother embodied the physical and moral qualities that would secure the future of the German race. Her body, her behavior, and her beliefs were all subjects of state interest and intervention. The regime crafted a detailed ideological blueprint for what such a mother should look like, how she should live, and what her responsibilities should be, turning womanhood into an instrument of national policy. The foundation of the Aryan mother ideal rested on notions of racial science, or what the Nazis called racial hygiene. This pseudo-scientific doctrine claimed that the health, intelligence, and character of each individual were determined largely by heredity, and that the German race was biologically superior. According to this belief, the mother was the vessel through which this racial purity was reproduced. While fathers contributed biologically, Nazi ideology argued that mothers carried far greater responsibility because they shaped the next generation not only through childbirth, but through daily socialization and moral instruction. In speeches, Hitler, Himmler, and other leaders framed the womb as a battleground for racial survival, giving motherhood an almost sacred quality. Propaganda intensified this imagery, portraying Aryan mothers as serious, devoted, and physically perfect. Posters showed blonde-haired women with serene expressions, surrounded by children who embodied racial health, rosy cheeks, clear eyes, strong posture. These images were not mere aesthetic choices, but ideological messages. They instructed German women to align themselves with a specific physical type: light hair, fair skin, athletic build, and overall vitality. Women whose appearance diverged from this ideal often felt pressure to conform, altering hairstyles, dress, and even lifestyle habits to match the Aryan aesthetic. The idealized Aryan body became both a symbol of national pride and a tool of social pressure. Beyond physical traits, the ideal mother was expected to cultivate a personality consistent with Nazi ideology. She was to be obedient, disciplined, and self-sacrificing. She should avoid vanity, intellectualism, and modern feminist ideas, all of which the Nazis viewed as threats to traditional gender roles. Her purpose was to dedicate her life to her family and, by extension, the state. Individual ambitions outside the home were discouraged, and women who pursued professional careers were often criticized for failing to fulfill their racial duty. Nazi officials emphasized that while men fought and worked, women's highest service lay in nurturing a racially pure family. The shaping of this ideal was supported by a dense network of educational programs designed to produce ideologically loyal mothers. Girls in the League of German Girls, Bund Deutscher Mädel, or BDM, received training in physical fitness, domestic skills, and racial theory from an early age. These lessons instilled a vision of future motherhood that aligned with state priorities. Young women learned that their bodies belonged not only to themselves, but to the nation, and that their personal choices carried political consequences. This early indoctrination created generations of women who viewed motherhood as both a privilege and a national mission. Marriage was also heavily politicized within Nazi ideology. The regime advocated that Aryan women marry young, preferably to men who met racial standards and demonstrated ideological loyalty. To secure what they considered high-quality marriages, government agencies screened couples, evaluating factors like ancestry, health, and social background. A union between two racially fit individuals was portrayed as an act of patriotism. The ideal Aryan mother was therefore expected not only to choose a suitable partner, but to produce large families. Birth control and abortion were aggressively discouraged for Aryan women, who were told that each child they bore strengthened the German nation. State programs reinforced this vision through awards and social recognition. The Mother's Cross, awarded in bronze, silver, or gold, celebrated women who bore 4, 6, or 8 children respectively. Receiving this decoration elevated a woman's social standing, signaling that she exemplified the Aryan maternal ideal. Public ceremonies, newspaper announcements, and special privileges further incentivized large families. These rewards created a visible hierarchy of motherhood, placing women who embraced their reproductive duty at the top of social recognition. Yet Nazi ideology did not merely define what the ideal mother should be, it also dictated what she should reject. Women were warned against lifestyles associated with degenerate or foreign influences, such as jazz culture, urban modernism, or what the Nazis saw as excessive independence. Women who remained unmarried or childless were sometimes suspected of selfishness or disloyalty to the racial cause. This moral pressure reinforced conformity and discouraged deviation from prescribed roles. Religion also played a complicated role in shaping the ideal Aryan mother. While some Nazi leaders attempted to reinterpret Christianity through a racial lens, others pushed for a new, pagan-inspired spirituality centered on nature, ancestry, and blood. In either case, religious imagery was manipulated to elevate motherhood as a sacred duty. For example, Nazi rhetoric often compared Aryan women to ancient Germanic heroines or mythological figures who represented fertility and racial endurance. This blending of politics and spirituality helped create an emotional narrative that framed motherhood as a transcendent responsibility. The Nazi state further expected the ideal mother to serve as a moral guide. She was responsible for teaching children discipline, cleanliness, and loyalty from infancy. Everyday activities, from bathing to mealtime routines, were infused with ideological meaning. Mothers were encouraged to praise bravery, obedience, and physical strength in their children, while discouraging weakness or excessive emotional expression. Even toys and books were selected to reinforce militarism and racial pride. The idealized Aryan household was therefore not only a space of domestic comfort, but a miniature training ground for future citizens of the Reich. Nazi Germany constructed an extensive system of government policies aimed at reshaping motherhood into a tool of the racial state. These policies intruded deeply into family life, controlling marriage, fertility, childcare, health, and even the emotional expectations placed upon women. Unlike ordinary social programs, which might support families through financial or educational initiatives, Nazi policies operated with explicit racial and ideological objectives. Their purpose was not merely to promote population growth, but to curate and engineer a population that matched the regime's vision of a racially pure and politically loyal society. In doing so, they transformed motherhood from a personal and private experience into a regulated institution instrumental to the functioning of the Third Reich. One of the earliest and most influential policies implemented by the Nazi regime was the marriage loan program, introduced in 1933. Designed to encourage young Aryan couples to marry and have children, the program provided newlyweds with a substantial loan that could be gradually forgiven as the couple produced offspring. A quarter of the loan was canceled for each child, meaning that a family with 4 children would owe nothing. Although framed as a benevolent policy supporting families, its underlying purpose was deeply racial. Only couples who met strict racial criteria and passed health screenings could qualify. The intention was to promote marriages between individuals deemed racially valuable and discourage unions that did not align with Nazi ideals of hereditary purity. The state also introduced strict laws governing reproduction, targeting those they considered unfit. The 1933 Law for the Prevention of Hereditarily Diseased Offspring mandated compulsory sterilization for individuals diagnosed with a wide range of conditions, including mental disabilities, epilepsy, physical deformities, and alcoholism. Physicians, judges, and bureaucratic committees enforced the law with ruthless efficiency. Over 400,000 people were sterilized under this policy, many against their will. This program had a profound impact on motherhood, excluding vast numbers of women from the possibility of bearing children on the grounds that they would pollute the Aryan gene pool. The Nazi state thus defined motherhood not as a universal female role, but as a privilege reserved for those deemed biologically acceptable. A related policy was the expansion of the Lebensborn program, which supported mothers considered racially valuable and facilitated the birth of children who met Aryan criteria. Lebensborn homes provided medical care, financial support, and housing for unmarried mothers deemed racially fit, encouraging them to bear children outside traditional marriages. While publicly presented as maternity homes, the program played a far more insidious role in occupied territories, where it became involved in the kidnapping and Germanization of children considered racially desirable. These children were placed with German families and raised as Aryans. The Lebensborn program thus exemplified how the Nazi regime used motherhood as a weapon of demographic expansion and cultural assimilation. To strengthen the ideological education of mothers, the regime implemented policies requiring women to attend mandatory courses on household management, child-rearing, and racial science. These programs, overseen by organizations such as the National Socialist Women's League, were designed to standardize maternal practices across the country. Women learned how to maintain a healthy German household, how to care for infants according to state-approved guidelines, and how to instill Nazi values into their children. This training was not optional. For women seeking state benefits, social support, or membership in certain organizations, participation was expected or required. As a result, motherhood became a discipline monitored and shaped through formal instruction. Government policies also influenced the daily health and behavior of mothers. The regime issued detailed guidelines on nutrition, exercise, and hygiene, claiming that the biological quality of children depended on the physical condition of the mother. Mothers were encouraged to follow strict diets, spend time outdoors, and maintain homes that reflected order and racial discipline. Public health programs included prenatal care, medical examinations, and state monitoring during pregnancy. Hospitals and clinics became tools of the racial state, expected to identify and report cases that deviated from ideological norms. In this environment, pregnancy was not just a personal experience, but a medically supervised and politically charged event. The regime also sought to regulate abortion and contraception. For Aryan women, abortion was strictly prohibited except in cases where the fetus was considered genetically unfit. Birth control was discouraged, and information about contraception became increasingly restricted. The state's message was clear: racially valuable women had a duty to reproduce as often as physically possible. By contrast, abortion and sterilization were encouraged or forced upon women from groups considered undesirable, including Jewish, Roma, Slavic, and disabled women. This dual system revealed the racial hierarchy embedded in Nazi population policies. Motherhood was promoted for some and destroyed for others. Housing policies also shaped motherhood under the regime. Families with multiple children received priority access to larger apartments and suburban homes designed according to Nazi ideals of domestic life. These homes promoted traditional gender roles by including spacious kitchens, gardens, and areas meant for household labor. The state aimed to create environments where mothers could efficiently fulfill their domestic duties and raise healthy children. At the same time, families with fewer children or lacking racial approval often faced housing discrimination. Mothers were therefore incentivized to align their reproductive choices with state expectations to secure better living conditions. Economic policies further reinforced the maternal role. The regime discouraged women from remaining in the workforce, especially after marriage. Employers were encouraged to dismiss married women to make room for male workers, and women were pressured to leave professional careers in favor of homemaking. Tax incentives favored families with children, and penalties targeted those who remained childless. Government propaganda emphasized that a woman's greatest contribution to the nation was not economic, but biological. This ideology shaped labor policies, social expectations, and the opportunities available to women across the country. The education system also played a significant role in shaping future mothers. Girls were taught domestic skills, racial science, and physical education from a young age, preparing them for their eventual roles as wives and mothers. Textbooks emphasized female obedience, modesty, and the importance of choosing a racially suitable spouse. These curricula worked in tandem with youth organizations like the League of German Girls to create a population of young women who viewed motherhood as their primary destiny and civic duty. As the regime progressed, government control over motherhood intensified. Bureaucratic systems tracked births, marriages, and family backgrounds with meticulous care. Women who gave birth to large numbers of racially acceptable children were celebrated as models of national virtue, receiving medals, public recognition, and financial rewards. Women who failed to meet these expectations faced social stigma or state intervention. Even the moral behavior of mothers was monitored. Women were expected to remain loyal, modest, and ideologically pure. Deviations from these norms could lead to public shaming or the loss of social benefits. In Nazi Germany, organizations dedicated to mobilizing women and mothers formed one of the most powerful pillars of the regime's social engineering apparatus. These organizations served not only as administrative structures, but as ideological engines, shaping the beliefs, behaviors, and daily routines of millions of German women. By embedding themselves deeply into communities, workplaces, and homes, they ensured that Nazi values permeated every corner of female life. More importantly, they transformed motherhood from an intimate family role into a political mission intertwined with the racial and national goals of the state. Through training courses, propaganda, social pressure, and surveillance, these organizations mobilized mothers as active participants in the regime's racial project. At the center of this mobilization stood the National Socialist Women's League, NS Frauenschaft. Founded in 1931, but vastly expanded after Hitler's rise to power, the organization served as the primary conduit between the Nazi Party and German women. Led by Gertrude Schultz-Klink, a figure portrayed as the embodiment of the Aryan female ideal, the NS Frauenschaft promoted ideological conformity, domestic discipline, and racial consciousness. Its membership quickly grew into the millions, encompassing women from urban centers, small towns, and rural communities. Far from being a voluntary social club, the NS Frauenschaft functioned as a compulsory cultural institution, shaping the identity of women through a combination of education, peer pressure, and state-sponsored obligation. The NS Frauenschaft's activities were broad and deeply influential. The organization ran courses on child rearing, household management, nutrition, hygiene, and racial science. These classes reinforce the idea that motherhood was both a biological and ideological duty. Women learned to prepare meals that promoted racial health, maintain homes in a manner deemed appropriate by the state, and raise children who would become loyal followers of Hitler. These teachings were explicitly political. Every aspect of domestic life, from how a mother interacted with her baby to how she cleaned her kitchen, was framed as part of a larger national struggle. The German women's enterprise, Deutsches Frauenwerk, a closely related organization, focused on cultural education and community building. It organized lectures, exhibitions, and training programs aimed at shaping women into disciplined, devoted citizens of the Reich. Women were taught the value of traditional German crafts, folk culture, and homemaking skills, all presented through the lens of racial ideology. The Frauenwerk's activities helped reinforce the regime's narrative that modernity, feminism, and cosmopolitan lifestyles were corrupting influences. By promoting a curated version of tradition, the organization aimed to reshape cultural memory and identity among German women. Youth organizations also played a profound role in shaping future mothers. The League of German Girls, Bund Deutscher Mädel, or BDM, targeted girls aged 14 to 18, while the Young Girls League, Jungmädelbund, enrolled younger children. These organizations prepared girls for their future roles as mothers long before they reached adulthood. Physical fitness was emphasized, as healthy bodies were seen as essential for producing strong Aryan children. Girls also learned domestic skills, first aid, childcare, and the basics of racial theory. Camping trips, marches, and group activities instilled obedience, camaraderie, and emotional loyalty to the regime. For many girls, the BDM became a central part of their identity, shaping their understanding of purpose, duty, and womanhood. The influence of the BDM extended far beyond adolescence. When girls graduated from the organization, they entered adulthood already primed to embrace the Nazi ideal of motherhood. Many went on to join the NS Frauenschaft or participate in other community organizations, creating a seamless pipeline from ideological training to maternal mobilization. The generational continuity ensured that women raised within the Nazi system would instill its values in their own children, reinforcing a cycle of ideological reproduction. Some organizations directly supported the regime's racial policies at a practical level. The National Socialist People's Welfare Organization, NSV, played a key role in managing social programs aimed at racially valuable families. The NSV distributed financial aid, medical care, food, and clothing to mothers deemed worthy, while withholding support from those considered undesirable. The organization also conducted home inspections to ensure that families met standards of cleanliness, discipline, and ideological loyalty. Mothers who failed to meet expectations could be reprimanded or reported, turning welfare programs into a mechanism of surveillance and control. The Mother's Service, an initiative under the NS Frauenschaft, provided structured training to women in preparation for motherhood. Coursework included lessons on infant care, nutrition, household budgeting, racial instruction, and the ideological foundations of National Socialism. These classes were ostensibly educational, but functioned as indoctrination. They reinforced the idea that motherhood was not a personal choice, but a political responsibility. Women were taught to sacrifice personal ambition, individuality, and even emotional expression for the good of the nation. The Mother's Service thus played a critical role in standardizing female behavior across Germany. Church organizations also intersected with state efforts to mobilize mothers. Although the Nazi regime attempted to control and eventually suppress independent religious institutions, many Protestant and Catholic women's groups initially collaborated with or adapted to Nazi policies. Some churches incorporated aspects of racial ideology into their teachings, while others tried to maintain traditional religious roles for mothers. However, as the regime tightened its control, independent women's organizations were dissolved, absorbed into the NS-Frauenschaft, or pressured into ideological compliance. This centralization ensured that no space remained for alternative interpretations of motherhood that challenged the state's narrative. In Nazi Germany, motherhood became deeply intertwined with the state's racial engineering project. Every pregnancy, every birth, and every maternal responsibility was shaped by the regime's obsessive pursuit of racial purity. For Nazi leaders, mothers were not just caregivers but biological instruments through which the so-called Aryan race would be expanded, strengthened, and protected. This chapter explores how eugenics, racial ideology, and political policy fused to create a framework in which motherhood became a state-directed mission. The concept of racial purification, or Rassenhygiene, laid the foundation for Nazi population policy. It was grounded in the belief that biological heredity determined the strength of the nation. According to this ideology, only racially valuable women, those considered genetically healthy and Aryan, were deemed fit to reproduce. The state therefore positioned mothers as frontline participants in a biological war, one fought not with weapons but with wombs, genes, and selective breeding. Eugenics had existed in Europe and the United States long before Hitler came to power, but the Nazis expanded it into a totalitarian system. Under their rule, mothers were evaluated, categorized, rewarded, or punished according to racial criteria. Legislation, such as the 1933 Law for the Prevention of Hereditarily Diseased Offspring, enabled compulsory sterilization for individuals deemed genetically unfit, including those with disabilities, mental illness, epilepsy, deafness, or behavioral disorders. As a result, hundreds of thousands of Germans, many of them young women, were forcibly sterilized, leaving deep emotional scars and severing future chances for motherhood. For the women the regime did value, incentives were generous. In their view, Aryan motherhood represented a sacred biological duty. The state awarded the Mother's Cross, bronze, silver, or gold, to women who bore 4, 6, or 8 children. Propaganda glorified large Aryan families, portraying them as heroic contributors to national survival. But beneath this praise was an unmistakable demand. Compliant mothers should produce as many racially desirable children as possible. The Lebensborn program further illustrates the blend of ideology and social engineering. Established under Heinrich Himmler's SS, Lebensborn homes served as maternity centers where racially pure unmarried mothers could give birth without stigma. These homes also became centers of adoption and child selection, ensuring that children born within them met SS racial standards. Although later myths exaggerated the program, its real purpose was unmistakably ideological: to expand the Aryan population under controlled, state-approved conditions. At the other extreme was the brutal reality of Nazi extermination policy. As the regime expanded its racial agenda, eugenics turned into genocide. Motherhood, once celebrated for Aryan women, became grounds for persecution when applied to Jewish, Roma, or Slavic mothers. These women were seen not as human beings, but as threats to racial purity. Pregnant women in camps were frequently murdered upon arrival. Many mothers were forced to watch their children taken from them and killed. The same regime that glorified motherhood for some systematically destroyed it for others. Within Germany itself, everyday life for Aryan mothers was shaped by constant pressure to conform to racial ideals. Women were expected to maintain physical health, avoid undesirable partners, and submit to periodic health evaluations. Doctors, nurses, and midwives acted as agents of the state, reporting genetic concerns and guiding reproductive decisions. Even intimate choices, marriage, sexual relations, contraception, were scrutinized through the lens of racial ideology. As the war intensified, contradictions in Nazi population policy became more evident. The regime wanted more Aryan births, but simultaneously mobilized women for labor, especially after 1942. Food shortages, bombings, and the deaths of millions of men significantly reduced birth rates. Meanwhile, eugenics programs continued with increasing brutality. Children in occupied territories were kidnapped and Germanized, while others, considered racially inferior, were murdered or subjected to horrific medical experiments. Ultimately, Nazi eugenics transformed motherhood into a highly politicized, deeply coercive institution. The ideology sought to control not only how many children women bore, but also who was allowed to be a mother at all. It created a hierarchy of reproduction, celebrated for some, forbidden for others, and deadly for millions. The legacy of these policies remains one of profound trauma, loss, and moral devastation. When World War II erupted, the lives of mothers in Nazi Germany were transformed in profound and often contradictory ways. The regime had long preached that women should remain at home, focused on family and child-rearing, yet the realities of total war demanded their increasing participation in labor, civil defense, and wartime support roles. This chapter explores the complex and often painful adjustments mothers were forced to make as Germany moved deeper into a war that reshaped every aspect of daily life. At the start of the war in 1939, Nazi leaders reassured German families that the conflict would be short, efficient, and victorious. Mothers embraced this message, believing they could continue raising children in relative security. But as the war expanded, its distance collapsed. Millions of men were conscripted, leaving women to manage households alone. Mothers became heads of families overnight, juggling rationing, childcare, work, and constant anxiety over loved ones on the front. The emotional burden was tremendous, compounded by the uncertainty of life under a regime that demanded absolute submission, even as the war brought growing suffering. Rationing quickly became one of the central realities of wartime motherhood. Food, clothing, and fuel were strictly controlled, and mothers spent long hours navigating bureaucratic systems to secure basic necessities. Although the Nazi state tried to maintain a facade of abundance, shortages grew severe, especially from 1942 onward. Mothers had to stretch limited supplies, substitute ingredients, and endure repeated shortages that left children hungry and sick. Queuing for food became a daily ordeal, often lasting hours, and the weight of ensuring a family's survival fell entirely on women. As the war escalated, air raids became a terrifying part of everyday life. Mothers were responsible for getting children to shelters, maintaining emergency supplies, and protecting the elderly. Raids struck without warning, destroying homes, schools, and entire neighborhoods. Mothers carried infants while guiding older children through smoke-filled streets, sometimes emerging from shelters to find everything they owned reduced to rubble. The psychological toll was immense, particularly when families were displaced, forced to relocate to rural areas, or separated from husbands and sons who could not return from the front. Education and childcare also underwent dramatic change. Schools were damaged or closed, teachers conscripted, and classrooms relocated to makeshift facilities. Mothers had to balance work with home-based education, a nearly impossible task in overcrowded shelters or temporary lodgings. Many children were evacuated to the countryside in programs reminiscent of the British evacuation system, though rooted in Nazi ideology. Mothers faced heart-wrenching choices: keep children close in danger zones or send them away for uncertain safety. Despite the hardships, the state continued to enforce ideological conformity. Mothers were expected to maintain their commitment to Nazi values, even as war made those ideals increasingly unrealistic. Propaganda emphasized resilience, sacrifice, and loyalty to Hitler, portraying mothers as stoic guardians of the home front. Yet behind closed doors, many women expressed doubt, fear, and quiet resentment. Diaries reveal moments of despair, particularly as casualty notices arrived with growing frequency. Mothers bore the emotional devastation of losing sons, sometimes more than one, to a war they had no power to question. Labor demands created another contradiction. The Nazi regime had long discouraged women from entering the workforce, but by 1943, the German economy was collapsing under the strain of prolonged war. Mothers were urged, then pressured, then conscripted into factories, farms, and civil defense roles. They repaired machinery, sorted munitions, staffed offices, and served in anti-aircraft units. While essential to Germany's war effort, these roles forced women into exhausting routines: long shifts, long queues, and long nights in air raid shelters with overtired children. Relations with concentration camp laborers and prisoners of war further complicated moral life on the home front. Mothers in rural areas encountered forced laborers sent to work on farms, while those in cities might encounter prisoners working in factories. Some women treated these laborers with sympathy. Others internalized Nazi racial policies and reinforced harsh treatment. Daily life in wartime Germany unfolded in the shadow of widespread violence, even for those not directly involved. By 1944 and 1945, the collapse of civilian life became unavoidable. Mothers endured freezing winters without heating fuel, blackouts, disease outbreaks, and severe malnutrition. Many took extraordinary risks to find food, barter goods, or secure medical care. The final months of the war were filled with chaos: refugees fleeing the Eastern Front, bombing campaigns destroying transportation networks, and widespread fear of invasion. Mothers struggled to maintain a sense of normalcy for their children, even as the world around them disintegrated.